And today this session is going to be discussing the rising concerns of leaf-footed bugs and stink bugs, as well as seeing what the feeding damage is causing and review some of the research that has been conducted in order to help manage some of these pests. So up first, we have Machado with Blue Diamond. Then we had a change in our agenda where we'll have Mateo Marquez speaking first with Integral Ag, and then Kent Daane with UC Berkeley last. So up first is Mel.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I want to dive into this and give you an idea of what's been going on here over the last few years and the trends that we're seeing in plant bug. For those of you who may be fortunate enough to not know what the problem is, it can be pretty extensive. It's a minor pest a lot of people think of. It's an occasional pest, but it's a situation where it sucks if it's you and it's in your orchard. So basically, we're looking at leaf-footed plant bugs, and that was the one that really popped up first for a lot of growers, although the stink bugs have been around for years, for let's just say for decades, but not really known for feeding on almonds, but now they are definitely an issue within almonds. And then we've got the brown marmorated stink bug, which is in the lower left. That's a new invasive pest that was endemic here in Sacramento, within the city limits of Sacramento for years, and moved down the valley through Highway 99 on traffic. Also, box elder bugs. Very, very rarely do I get questions of box elder bugs, but I've seen them out there along the Stanislaus River. They were coming out as early as bloom. We were finding box elder bugs being attracted to the Sonora variety in particular. So in my experience, these bugs have a varietal preference. And I will tell growers, if you're out there looking for them, you want to look at Sonora, Price, Aldrich, and Fritz first, because they tend to go there first. And ignore your nonpareil for the time being until you actually determine that you've got them out there. If you don't know what the damage looks like, that's what it looks like. And in this case, it's on Monterey. They probe that kernel with their proboscis, much like a mosquito probes you. There's some similarities too. They're injecting a fluid, a solution into that tissue as well. You can think of it as an anticoagulant. That also carries a yeast, which can cause additional problems. The USDA, the way they define brown spot, it's kind of a either or situation, but you can have the depression where you can see that tissue is sunk or depressed because of the damage that was inflicted upon it. And you can have the discoloration, or you can have one or the other. In both cases, because it was probed by an insect, that kernel is deemed inedible and it counts as a reject. Okay. How bad can it get? It can get ugly. In this case, this particular grower on Carmel lost his Carmel. It was over 30%. It was rendered oil stock. So it can really be a problem if you're going forward with it. Now, what's the damage look like up close? You'll see in some cases multiple stings. You'll see single stings. That nut on the right really doesn't have that wax exudate on it, but it's definitely been probed by an insect and probed multiple times. Okay, and again, they will go after it. One species that we hear that the brown marmorated will just continue to hammer that nut and go after it, where the plant bug, the leaf-footed plant bug, not so much, but it's a big bug and you get one sting and it can kill the nut if it's early in the season, April or so, and drop it to the ground. Later in the season, you don't kill the nut, you wind up with brown spot, and it counts as a reject. So people are seeing problems early in the season where it looks like they've been shook in the worst case. In the absolute worst case, I had one grower that says, I'm just pulled up upon him one day, and he said, boy, I'm sure glad stink bug doesn't like almonds. It does. Well, no, it doesn't. What are you talking about? Well, I had a neighbor that cut his hay, and the stink bugs are coming out of the field. Let's go look. And as we drove up to the field, I thought the guy was going to cry. It literally looked like it had been shook. It was a Butte Padre block. It was the first part of April, and everything was on the ground. But later on in the season, you wind up with rejects. Now, there is this question about pellicle ink stain. Pellicle ink stain, to me, the classic case of pellicle ink stain, pellicle being the peel, is on Sonora. And it looks on the Sonora variety like you took a pencil lead and just rubbed it on the peel. That is the result of Aspergillus niger infections. It is not what we consider to be a reject because it's always small enough that it doesn't qualify as a reject. So there is a question of, is this brown spot or is this ink stain? So that one nut there, if I bring it up close, there's no probe. There's no point where that kernel was probed or penetrated with it. That would be ink stain. It's not a reject. So where it's been traditionally on the Sonora, we're seeing it on other varieties. I saw it on Ruby one time where it looked like measles. It was really a weird kind of infection pattern on it. But there is that question. And normally what you're dealing with is brown spot, not ink stain. Okay. This one's one of my favorite ones. You're looking at that nut and you're going, oh, this thing's going to be a mess inside. Okay. Well, let's open it up. And yeah, the kernel is a mess. Okay. And this was a Padre of all things. And you look inside the shell, where you had that nasty problem on the outside, okay, and you've got a nasty problem on the kernel, there's nothing indicating any problems on the inside of the shell, which I find interesting. How does that happen? Who knows? Now, the inside of the shell doesn't matter to us. It was just an interesting point. How does this occur? And then there's this one, okay? Anybody in the audience want to take a guess at what that is? Is that ink stain or is that brown spot? Here's the problem. That's the inside of a double, okay? Two nuts together. So it's obviously not brown spot. And how did a pathogen get inside of there to cause ink stain? It's one of the great mysteries of life for me in almonds. Okay, so if you take the peel off, if you blanch them, you wind up with that damage internally. This is the result of the yeast. Okay, you can cut them open and you can see the damage in there. So they're definitely inedibles. They're definitely count as a reject. Now, I'm going to throw some numbers at you. Let's just summarize it this way. The 23 crop is one, as many growers would tell you, to forget because of the damage we've had. I have yet to have a conversation with a grower this year about brown spot. Okay, now, in this example, last year, and I've made this up, but you'll see what goes on here. Last year, he had 4% total rejects in that delivery that came in. 3% of it was brown spot, or 75% of the total. Okay, and you had a little bit of ant, a little bit of orange worm, but you had 3% of that total damage was brown spot. This year, you got 20% damage. Okay, and I'm sure there's people in this room went, yeah, okay, I know how that feels. And 75% of it's navel orange worm, okay, or 15% total rejects. 15% of the damage is brown spot for a grand total of 3. You had the same amount of brown spot damage, the same amount of damage from feeding of plant bugs, but the navel orange worm has overpowered it and you're not thinking about that. And I've had several growers comment to me that, yeah, well, the navel orange worm ate up all the brown spot. There wasn't enough there to find. We can laugh about it. That might have been the case in a few examples. So what we have here, going back to 2014, this is breakdown data. Now, in our organization of Blue Diamond, we will provide a breakdown of the cause of the rejects to any grower that asks for it. And we're pushing this program as hard as we can. I'll say in most recent days, we're talking about almost 200 million pounds of data. It's a fraction of our total handle. What I tell growers is if you're delivering 10 loads, get 1 or 2 with breakdown data. Okay. If you're delivering 1 load from that orchard, make sure you get breakdown data on it. You need to know what the cause of your problem is. It doesn't do any good to be fighting navel orange worm if your problem's ants or if it's plant bugs. So keep in mind that the reject levels you see here under that RJS percentage column, that is the percentage of those that asked for it, that asked for the damage. Now, if I go back into the 70s, at the bottom of Blue Diamond statements, some of you guys have been around a long time, may remember there was a notation there that says traditionally 75 to 80% of the reject damage is attributable to navel orange worm. It's not the case anymore. So here's that NOW column, and you can see that, like in this last year, 3.84, and this is as of a week ago. Okay, and we're still receiving, but as of this last year, in the case of Aldrich, it was averaging 3.84% damage. 69% of that was orange worm. 7.96 was brown spot. So I highlighted the 2 columns there as the ones that we want to talk about here. Orange worm is, as a total percentage of the damage, I'll say less, because other things have increased. The thing that's been alarming to me is you look at that brown spot column and you see how over time the damage has increased. We've been watching this ramp up. And then last year, and you'll see this as I go through several varieties, last year it ebbed off a little bit. It wasn't as bad. And then this year it's a lower percentage. Why? Because the navel orange worm has really taken off in comparison to it. So last year, my belief is, and I could be wrong, that what we're seeing is a greater knowledge of the problem. We've been watching this trend increase. We fired the alarm off with the university, with several PCAs in the community, and said, we got a problem, we need to work on this. We've got Jalindra going, we've got David Havlin going, a lot of people working on this, and a lot more conversation about it. So my belief is we've had more acknowledgement and more understanding of the problem. Now, some will tell me, okay, but we lost chlorpyrifos, we lost Lorsban, which is one of the better material, or was one of the better materials for it. Which one is offsetting? But I just want to note, we saw the trend rising. and it's gone down a little bit. This year's an anomaly because of navel orange worm. If you look at price, same trend. This year's way off, okay, because of the navel orange worm. Keep in mind what I told you about, 4% versus 20. In a lot of cases, the same level of damage, it's just a lower percentage of the total. Fritz, look at the navel orange worm. Of the guys that asked, about 5.5% average damage. Good Lord. Over 3/4 of it's navel orange worm. So it stands, there's not much left to count towards plant bug. Sonora. Okay, Sonora I call a worm magnet because it loves it. And the trend has been a little flatter historically. Okay, we had a spike in 2020, ironically in a good year. Navel orange worm was less, so the spike goes up and the other causes of damage. And then Monterey. Everybody knows that Monterey can get hammered by that last flight. And we saw that trend going. And this year, again, it backed off. But don't rest on your laurels and think, well, I don't have a problem. It's still out there. Okay. And then Butte Padre. I like to poke fun at Butte Padre growers. Those of you who are Blue Diamond guys in here, I love to do this because the Butte Padre guys say, we don't have navel orange worm problems. Yeah, you can. It's just different. I'll acknowledge that tomorrow at the other session. The reject damage is lower, but it's still part of the program out there. It's still part of the population of the orchards. And plant bugs love Butte and Padre. They go after it. Independence. We tend to think of independence as a navel orange worm problem because of the mummy loads, because of the difficulty in shaking. Ironically, as a percentage of the damage, it's not that big. They obviously love, or plant bug loves independence though, because it's in high all along. Okay, now, in this case, forgive me for the funny charts here, but I'm going to show you the Sacramento Valley, the northern San Joaquin, and the southern San Joaquin, the line of demarcation, the Merced Madera. Merced and San Joaquin, Merced, Stanislaus, and San Joaquin County is what we call the central region of the northern San Joaquin. So the black line is the reject level of those deliveries where growers asked for a breakdown. And you can see it moves up and down. And 2020 was low. This last year was ugly. It's almost 5% in the case of Aldrich here. And that orangish bar is the navel orange worm level. And then the brown spot's the blue one. And you can see there are years like when 2020, when navel orange worm was low, it obviously becomes a bigger part of the problem. Rejects in general were lower that year, but those guys that had brown spot problems with plant bugs definitely had to fight it. In the northern San Joaquin, a little bit different situation here as far as total reject levels, but still, navel orange worm is predominant and plant bug can get you. And in the southern San Joaquin, they have bigger issues down there with rejects in general, attributable to navel orange worm, but the plant bugs are out there. Same thing in Monterey. I'm going to look at the front end of the harvest and the back end of the harvest. With Monterey, obviously navel orange worm is a big problem, but don't forget the plant bugs. It's there. Okay, just give you an idea of what's going on. Wanted to acknowledge that. If you've not seen it in the field, on that upper left photo, you've got kernels, almonds that are turning yellow. Okay, they've been stung, they've been sequestered, they're going to drop off the tree, they will fall off. For a lot of people, the first sign that they have is that clear exudate on that photo in the upper right-hand corner, and you wonder what's going on. I've had growers swear that they got froze. Warmest or coldest morning we had was 48. I don't think so. But they're looking at nuts and they're not understanding the damage. I've had growers swear that it's hail damage. No, and you can cut them open and you can find the sting. Lower left, those are recently hatched nymphs of the leaf-footed plant bug. That egg looks like a Tootsie Roll. Okay, and you will see predators work on those things too as well. And then the stink bug, I just happened to get lucky one day, pulled a mummy out of the tree and they were hatching out of it. I don't know which stink bug that is, but maybe Lauren, you do, but they were coming out of it. So a little idea for you on what we're seeing on levels of damage. Very concerned about the trend. The trend has apparently, at least numerically, abated in the last 2 years. Don't get too cocky about it though. It's still out there and it's something we're going to have to deal with. Okay.
Okay, so we'll have the opportunity to have questions at the end. So if you guys want to write them down and ask the speakers towards the end of the session. So up next we have Mateo, who will be talking about the PCA perspective of stink bugs in the orchard. Oh no, that's not in the right order. Okay, well, I guess maybe Kent, we're gonna have a switch. Sorry.
No worries.
All right, so Kent is going to be talking about the research now.
Great. Hey, thanks for inviting me here. It was great following Mel. Good information, great information. What I'm going to do is to talk about leaf-footed bug from more of a researcher's perspective, and a little bit about why some years might be worse than other years. As an outline, we'll go through the biology, stink bugs. I'm not going to talk about very much. I'll just mention the damage looks very similar. Leaf-footed bugs, biology, damage of leaf-footed bug, what we see happening throughout the season, and then some of the current controls we're thinking about, especially monitoring. I'm going to emphasize that these are, especially leaf-footed bug for the most part, is a spring pest. That's when we're most concerned about it. That's when it's dropping a tremendous number of nuts from the tree. As the shell gets harder, it gets a little bit more difficult for these insects to penetrate to the nut meat. So as mentioned, I'm just going to I'll focus on leaf-footed bug, but I will mention stink bugs are out there as well. This is a Thyanta. That, I think, is what might have been in Mel's picture as well. It's got the abdomen with those little black and white stripes. And when it first comes out, it's not reddish as much as kind of tan in color. There are a number of these green stink bug species. Brown marmorated, obviously you can tell it apart from the others. BMSB is becoming more of a localized pest. Around Jalendra's area, around the Stanislaus area, it can be quite damaging. But down where I am in Fresno, where David Haviland is down in Bakersfield, we just are not seeing the numbers build up in almonds or pistachios. So with the green stink bugs, I can tell them apart. Red-shouldered stink bug, pretty obvious, although winter form is kind of brownish in color. Green stink bug has got the 5 little yellow dots on the scutellum. We've got Say's stink bug and Euler's stink bug. Instead of 5 little spots, they've got 3 little spots. And they've got kind of an orange margin around their edge. Life cycle, egg, as Mel mentioned, you saw it, an egg, first instar is coming out. I have a hard time telling the stink bug nymphs apart. I can kind of do it if I go back to the pictures, but they have so many different color variations. They change color within each instar itself. So going from second to about a first to a second or third, the third and fourth instar, and then you got the 5th instar finally starts to look like a green stink bug, and then the adult that we know. What I'll point out is that when you see these nymphs in the orchard, that means an adult population has been there because these nymphs don't fly. The nymphs don't cause as much damage because their mouth parts are smaller. I'm not going to show data, but both for leaf-footed bug and stink bug, the size really does matter. So the larger the insect, the more damage it can cause. It's got larger, stronger mouth parts. So those small stages are really, first instars don't even feed. They just kind of cluster together. Second instars, third instars, they're really feeding on the outer part of the shell and not doing any damage to the kernel inside. Also, throughout the season, earlier in the season, the nuts are more susceptible. And Mel mentioned Fritz. In our studies, Fritz was one of the more susceptible cultivars to these plant bug species. Most of these stink bugs have got 2 generations per year. This is for brown marmorated stink bug in the Sacramento area. It's the overwintering population that we worry about for both stink bug and leaf-footed bug. So where your orchard is in connection to where that population is overwintering. For most of the stink bugs, I don't find them overwintering really inside the orchard, with the exception of the green stink bug. That's one I commonly find in the orchard as well. They cause very, very similar damage. Mel showed pictures of damage. They were great. You can see here in one of the slides, a little brown spot starting to form. The shell on the outside shows the gymnosis, and in the bottom picture, you can kind of see the kernel getting that initial flat tire look as the mouth parts went in, caused damage that will come across kernel at harvest time. Now, if you contrast that with the leaf-footed bug, I have a hard time when I see damage knowing if it's leaf-footed bug or stink bug without knowing what pest was in the orchard beforehand. The damage looks very, very similar to me between these 2 different groups. I will say that the adult leaf-footed bug causes more damage than the adult stink bug, and I think that's because it's larger. It's got bigger mouth parts. We also see this is a picture of with pistachio above and almond below. These stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs will get dirty mouth parts. They'll get different fungal contaminants on their mouthparts, and oftentimes move that into the nut itself. They're not true vectors. They're just carrying things like Bacteria on their mouthparts, and that moves into the kernel itself. So today we're going to focus more on leaf-footed bug. We've got 3 species. When I started with Dick Rice, who first pointed out these insects could be a pest in almonds and pistachios, really it was Leptoglossus clipialis. Zonotus was not as commonly found, and Zonotus is the one that we think now is causing most of the damage. It's the one you find in those super aggregations during the winter and coming into your orchards in mass. The Occidentalis I haven't seen in an almond orchard in a decade, since Dick Rice pointed it out to me. Just show you some of the initial work we did to look at damage throughout the season to show you why I think the early season is the most important period. So what we did is we enclosed a single leaf-footed bug on nuts for a 7-day period during different seasonal periods. We did this on different almond cultivars. I'm not going to present that data, but basically the softer shelled cultivars tend to have more damage. They seem to be more attracted to that. Then we rated different kinds of damage. So this is a March-April period, and we can see here drop nuts in that cage. About 95% of the nuts on average were dropped during that 7-day feeding period of a single individual leaf-footed bug. More for the adults, less for the nymphs. Basically, it could wipe out everything in that cage in just a 7-day period. If we break this down a little bit further by cultivar, you can see here Fritz, Carmel, Butte had more than Nonpareil and Mission. Those from drop nuts. We also saw some shell damage and nut damage, which followed the same. In the very beginning of the season, we don't get as much nut damage making it to harvest because we have so many dropped nuts. And this was from 2006. This is not shaking the nuts for harvest time. These are all dropped nuts from leaf-footed bug. And so we had a super year, and we'll get back to that a little bit later in the presentation, why that might have been. Later in the season, June, July, we get more of a shell hardening. We have far, far fewer dropped nuts, usually less than 2%, but now we're getting shell damage. We're seeing the feeding tube, we're seeing the gummosis, and that oftentimes translates to damage on the nuts. Not every single case. This is because sometimes they're probing, the gummosis is coming out, but they're not getting all the way into the nut itself, or the brown spot's not just forming. One of the things that I did notice, however, was that we would have feeding damage in June or July, open up that nut and not see any brown spot, but it would form maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks after the feeding damage. So it had a little delay in forming later in the season. Leaf-footed bug seasonal biology. Again, I think that early population, that overwintering population, is probably the one we should worry about the most. You've got populations near your orchard someplace, and we think sometimes of the movement of the leaf-footed bug going in a progression from different crops, and that has to do with when these nuts are becoming available. So almonds first, then pistachios, then they go to pomegranates, then they go to this overwintering site, right? We're thinking this way because we produce these crops. But really, they've got these other host plants that they're going to go to in between crop systems, and before they get to the almonds, after they're in the almonds, when they're in the almonds. They'll feed on some of the ground covers down below the almonds, although they prefer feeding on the almonds and pistachios. So why do we have different bad years? Why did people call me up and say, man, I saw a lot of stink bugs and leaf-footed bug this year compared to other years? First thing that might occur then is some of these alternate host plants. What Paul De Silva was a postdoc in the lab years ago working both in almonds and pistachios, focusing more on stink bugs. But what he pointed out is that when we get these very heavy wet years, we've got a lot more weedy vegetation around. when we have a lot more weedy vegetation, there's a lot more food for that overwintering population in February and March before they're going into the almond orchard. So you're getting a population which is a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, a little bit happier when they're coming into your field. And 2003 was a big almond year, a big wet year. I can also say it the opposite way. So in talking with Paul about this, I said, well, what happens if we've got a drought year and we've got fewer alternate host plants, fewer Russian thistle, things like that out there? Doesn't that mean they'll go straight to the almonds first? So this is something I still want to look at a little bit closer to find out what that connection is. This is work done with Jake Wenger at Fresno State and Houston Wilson. Just to point out, we've got leaf-footed bug collected in pistachio, almond, and pomegranate, and they used PCR analysis to find out what they've been feeding on other than almond, pistachio, and pomegranate. And just circled in red, we've got pistachio, almond, and pomegranate, and obviously that's most of where they're getting their food from. But look at cucurbit, for example. They are going to other host plants before or after they're in your field. So this management might be something we have to think about in the future. That's why, I worked so long trying to get cover crops to work for beneficial insects. And it's always a mixed bag with cover crops because they are food for other things, including some pests as well. So what's another possibility? I think a key are these overwintering populations. They overwinter in palm trees. They overwinter in juniper trees, cypress trees, riparian areas, citrus, olives, wood piles. We see them in pomegranates in the fall, but they typically then move someplace towards better shelter than the pomegranates sometime in late fall. So one of the things we noted in that super year, that year in 2006, where we had so much leaf-footed bug damage, these are the average low temperatures, low daily temperatures in Fresno. And I've got a line drawn down there at some of the coldest days. So you could see it never really got down below 28 degrees Fahrenheit very commonly. And really, we had very, very few freeze days. Leaf-footed bug all but disappeared in 2007. First, everyone was trigger happy. Everyone got so much damage in 2006. We could use Lorsban then. Lorsban was going on like crazy in 2007, 2008, 2009. And we do have to think about other materials now as well, because we are going to we're going to be limited on the neonics pretty soon. I digress. So here is 2007. And you could see there in middle of January, we had this cold period where we lost a lot of citrus. We were looking at leaf-footed bug overwintering in citrus. We were following these winter aggregations. And we saw during this period of cold, cold weather where it was dropping down to 23, 24 degrees night after night after night, we put just down a tarp, and all those leaf-footed bugs that were up in the canopy were down dead on the tarp. So I think cold weather really does harm that population. They're in an aggregation in part to survive some of that cold weather. They're not feeding in those winter aggregations. So it helps them later on for mating, which we'll talk about, and for dispersal. But I don't think that they're getting enough shelter unless they're underneath the fronds of a pine tree, deep inside a juniper tree. But if they're exposed on an olive or citrus tree, cold weather would really damage that population. 2022 to 23, overwintering was very similar to the 2005, 2006. And I thought that might have been a reason for a little bit elevated population that we saw. What's another possibility? Well, this is something that I studied for 3 years, and I never could prove it. The idea is that there are these superfoods out there for the fall period. Remember, I think it's the spring where we get most of our damage, and the spring is connected to an overwintering population, which is migrating for the most part into your orchard. I do see green stink bug in the orchard during the winter, but I tend to see the leaf-footed bug coming from someplace else into your field. We see aggregations there on pomegranate, citrus, and olive, which we followed. So the idea I had was that pomegranates are a superfood during the fall period, allowing the leaf-footed bug population to have a fourth generation or a partial fourth generation. So what we did is we looked at the overwintering survival of adult large nymph and small nymph leaf-footed bugs. We did this with and without food. We can see the red and the blue line are adults with food and without food. And with food, they survived until about April. So this population has to make it through the winter and to be able to be strong enough to fly into your system. Without food, most of them died, but we still had about 30% of the adult population surviving. Look now, both the large nymph and the small nymph, with or without food, by the time they're leaving that overwintering aggregation, they never made it to an adult population, and we had no mortality whatsoever. So I started to realize that the nymphs just don't survive. They've got to make it to an adult by about December, late November, or they're just not going to survive that winter period. So, and here we just look at the population, egg strands going out there in April, March, and then second generation, then we've got the second generation, we've got the adults from the third generation, and then they survive all the way into December. And we didn't get egg masses from that fourth generation. But what we found on pomegranates is that we were getting small and large nymphs in October that had to be, according to this data, had to be part of that third generation that were becoming adults, giving them a chance to survive and moving into your field. What I want to finish on is just a little work we've done with monitoring and then a tiny bit of work we did with natural enemies and ground covers. And the monitoring becomes important because of this biology. One of the key issues is that we've got these overwintering populations moving into your field with no way of easily, accurately monitoring them, at least economically. So we see here overwintering, monitoring leaf-footed bugs. We're looking at January, February, March. We're looking at mortality of the bugs and migration going out. So in that bottom graph, we see that period of winter mortality in January and February. And then there's the dispersal period in late February, early March. We were always saying these aggregations break up. Didn't seem really connected to the temperature. Maybe it was photoperiod. Maybe it was just a connection to daylight then. We tried all kinds of monitoring ways. We tried the standard beet sample. We did sweep samples of the ground vegetation. Sweep samples were pretty good for stink bugs. They were not good at all for leaf-footed bugs. We tried DVAC samples. It was a lot of work. It was somewhat accurate. It's not fun, and it's not economically viable at all. So we had to come up with a way to better sample for leaf-footed bugs. Visual samples, again, I like that. Mel pointed out the drop nuts in his and in my talk both. I really like walking the orchard early in the season when the nuts are susceptible and looking for drop nuts on the ground. Sometimes you see that faster than you can find the stink bugs or the leaf-footed bugs themselves. In pistachio, I look for the blackened nuts on the tree. Sometimes, again, that's easier than finding the stink bugs or leaf-footed bugs. One of the problems with the beet sample is that the adult leaf-footed bug is very wary of you and will move out of the way quickly when it sees you coming. I like just using a long 10-foot bamboo pole and beating the branches and counting the leaf-footed bug as it flies away. If you are going to use a beating tray early in the morning, it's a little bit easier because they're not apt to fly. They don't move quite as much. One of the other problems with all of these sampling methods is we really don't have any economic thresholds for this. As mentioned, they tend to accumulate in some cultivars, so these thresholds that we make will not work depending on the cultivar you've got as well. So we brought Jocelyn Miller in, who's a wonderful pheromone chemist at UC Riverside. I started working with Jocelyn on the leaf-footed bug pheromone when Houston Wilson arrived at Kearney, and I passed this project on to him. The idea is to come up with a pheromone or an aggregation pheromone, sex pheromone, alarm pheromone, something that we could use to monitor for these insects. We know that leaf-footed bugs, stink bugs, have got alarm, aggregation, sex, and an aphrodisiac pheromone that allows them to mate. We know that the males use the pheromone to attract and mate with females, and we wanted to see if we could leverage this into a lure system. First thing we had to do was find out what traps would work. We looked at uni-traps, hanging panel traps, pyramid traps, small and large, and a clear sticky trap, which is used for brown marmorated stink bug. We found that the hanging panel trap, especially when it was coated with fluon, was the best trap to use. We were catching leaf-footed bug, in this case, without any lures in it at all. They were just bumbling into it, and we could capture them, and far better than the other traps or better than the control. We can add fluon to it, as mentioned, and it will be a little bit better when we do that. We know that different colors of these traps have an impact. So yellow was best. We're still using the black traps because of the cost of painting the yellow. But if we can get a pheromone that works, we can probably get a company that will produce these in yellow that will be far more effective as well. What Jocelyn did in his laboratory in UC Riverside is that he used an antennogram and gas chromatograph to identify the chemical that the leaf-footed bug became excited looking at its antenna movement. When that chemical passed through the electroantennogram, the gas chromatograph would tell him what components were there that were exciting the leaf-footed bug. And he came up with this compound, which was new to science, called leptotrine. It then became Houston's task to see if this had any use in the field. And Houston or I have shown these data in the past leading up to this work. And so this is just from recent October 2023. We're looking at leptotrine alone or in combination with other lure components. But the bottom line is that leptotrine alone was far better at pulling these leaf-footed bugs in than the control, and adding these additional components didn't help it that much. That's better because when you're looking at the cost of a pheromone, every additional compound you have to add is bringing that cost of the pheromone up. One thing I'll say, this is in October, so this is at the end of the season. We were getting similar trap captures, always higher than the control throughout the season. One thing I'll say is that working with other folks, working with other Leptoglossus species and other stink bugs, we are catching dozens to hundreds in some of these other pheromones. So we're excited that leptotrine is working. We're not excited that the trap captures are still so low, even though they're better than the control. And one of the other questions I've got when I'm looking at this in terms of early season monitoring, working with Judith Stahl in my lab, we dissected out leaf-footed bugs that we collected in an aggregation and that we collected at the end of the season. So that's just looking at the ovaries and fat bodies in the top picture of a leaf-footed bug. You can kind of make out the two ovarioles going down into the sacs that have got the eggs in them. And in the bottom picture, you can see from what Mel showed in his picture that candy roll, I think he called it, of leaf-footed bug eggs that are about to be put out in the ovarioles. What we looked at too was the spermatheca. That's a sac that it has where it stores the sperm after mating. What we found was that in these winter aggregations, the males can mate with the females, and the females can store that sperm during the winter period and then leave that winter aggregation not needing to mate again. So that's good information for us to know. The one worry I've got is that means that the pheromone, if it's a sex pheromone, may not be as attractive in that early season period that's so critical at pulling the males in because the female may already be mated, so it may not be attracted to the female. Conversely, it might be better if the females are not putting out that pheromone. So this is something else we have to dig deeper in to see if we can make this work. Finally, I'll just mention that we spent 3 years working to see if we couldn't increase biological controls. Going clockwise, we see it's called the gray ant. It's a very good predator. It's also can be a little bit of a pest. It's feeding on a peach twig borer right there. We know it attacks smaller stages of stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs. We see a Trisulcus parasitoid attacking an egg mass. We see a green lacewing attacking a leaf-footed bug egg mass. And we see a parasitoid called gyron attacking a leaf-footed bug egg mass. What Judith did is she worked in an organic field, and we used a drip irrigation line that was moved from the center to back underneath on the berm underneath the trees every time they needed to irrigate. This allowed us to irrigate full season. We found, without going into detail in the results, we could increase the numbers of natural enemies. But it wasn't so much to make this economically beneficial unless you wanted to be organic with your cover crops in the row middles. So we're going to follow up on that a little bit more to see if we can't make it more effective with natural enemies. So in conclusion, stink bugs, large bugs cause very similar looking damage. The bigger the bug, the more damage it causes. So the adult causes more damage than the nymphs. The larger leaf-footed bug causes more damage than the smaller stink bugs. I think the overwintering population is critical. It determines how many come out alive and into your fields. And leaf-footed bugs might be mated when they come into your fields as well. For monitoring, we're making a lot of progress. We found a suitable trap. We've identified the key pheromone. We've synthesized all the other components, but we know that leptotrine is the key component. So that's the optimal blend we're going to use. Field trials have been positive, and what we need to do now is to cheapen the synthesis of leptotrine and then connect our trap counts to orchard damage so we can make it a little bit more effective. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I will take questions at the very end. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Kent. And up next, we have Mateo, who will be speaking from Integral Ag.
Hello. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you all on board. My name is Mateo Marquez. I'm with Integral Ag Inc. We're a group of independent consultants. We work throughout both the San Joaquin and the Sacramento valleys, primarily in tree nut crops. So I'm going to talk to you about plant bugs from a PCA perspective. So real quickly, a lot of this has already been touched on. So going to go over, defining the problem. What are plant bugs in almonds? What specifically are we talking about? And what kind of damage do they cause, and what are the scope of the damage? And then go into what I spend most of my days dealing with is monitoring, and then roll that into how we take that information that we've gathered from our monitoring and make treatment decisions based on that, and then wrap it up with what I see coming down the road. So plant bugs is really a general term that encompasses a lot of insects. And so in almonds, we're really talking about what I see three insects: the leaf-footed bug, the stink bugs, and the box elder bugs. So like I said, this has already been covered, so I won't spend too much time on this. And then as far as, we've been talking that there's been a trend of increasing pressure. So one thing we do for our clients is we collect samples at harvest and crack them out ourselves and inspect them for damage. And that's primarily for us to have insights on the decisions we've made throughout the season. And one of those things we track is plant bug damage. So this chart here is from our data that shows over the last 5 years, the average damage from all varieties and ranches right there. And so you can see there is a general upward trend, but as has been discussed, this is only a partial picture, because this is only what ends up in your harvest grade. There's a lot of damage, and probably the majority of damage doesn't even make it into the harvest bin because it drops from the tree. So when we talk about damage, plant bugs cause damage with their pure seed sucking mouth parts. You can see it there folded up under that stink bug. And you get physical damage from puncturing the nut, but then also, chemical or enzymatic or fungal introduction to facilitate their feeding. And so damage, I kind of think of damage as occurring in kind of two different stages, either prior to shell hardening or after shell hardening. Prior to shell hardening, we kind of see stuff like this, where I don't know if it's showing up in the picture there, but you can see some of those nuts are turning yellow. I don't know if this has a no laser pointer. Okay. So those yellow nuts are going to, so early in the season, those yellow nuts are going to abscise and drop from the tree. Once we get to shell hardening, those nuts are more likely to stick. And so we start to see more gumming develop inside the kernel. And then as the season progresses, the amount of the kernel that's damaged is really less and less until towards the end of the season we see just the brown spot like this. One interesting aspect that we don't really talk about when it comes to plant bugs is plant bug damaged nuts that stick in the tree tend to husk split early, as much as 14 or more days before healthy nuts husk split. And so this could have, this has the potential to have an interesting interaction with navel orangewort, providing a host site for either the tail end of the first generation or the leading edge of the second generation to cycle in the orchard and then hit your nonpareil again before, the tail end of the whole split period, right before you shake. So, again, we don't really talk about it, but it's just kind of another, if you have a lot of plant bug damaged nuts in your orchard, that, could be exacerbating a navel orangewort problem. So monitoring. So monitoring hasn't changed for plant bugs in decades. It really is, just all about scouting the field. And this is probably why we end up with a lot of damage in some years and others, because it's really time consuming, really tedious. You have to, you're spending your time walking fields, up and down, craning your neck upwards, scanning branches, scanning every single nut, trying to find, ideally you want to find the individual insect that's causing problems, right? But we don't always do that. We can't always do that. Sometimes we only find signs and symptoms, but those symptoms, while helpful, don't tell us the whole story. They don't tell us, because some of the symptoms can be something other than plant bug damage. Or they also don't have a temporal component to it. We don't know if is this old damage, is this new, how have they been here for a long time, or so it doesn't help us with our treatment decisions on its own always. But if you make regular, frequent checks your blocks, you're able to take those symptoms and make them more meaningful. And I'll kind of explain how we do that. So when we talk about signs and symptoms, this is primarily what we've talked about. We've already seen pictures of this. The gummosis on the sides of the nut. If you cut the hull, you can see the puncture wound goes through the hole, through the shell, and corresponding damage on the kernel as well, or the developing nut. And then a sign of the pest would be like the egg masses. And again, while these are great, they don't necessarily tell us, okay, so the first two, is this plant bugs? Or is it something else? And the last one, okay, yeah, there's stink bugs here, but here we are at whole split and there's stink bug eggs. Are we going to spray? I don't know, maybe not. So identification is, the most important fundamental when it comes to monitoring. You need to be able to accurately identify what you're seeing in the field. So I'm just going to roll through these insects because we've already seen a bunch of these pictures. So here's leaf-footed bugs. I got an adult, an egg mass, and then some, and on the right-hand picture is a aggregation of nymphs. And you can see, I like the picture of the adult because you can really get a sense for the scale. They're really big insects. They're very large. And so that makes them easy to see, easier to find, on a tree. But again, they tend to be up at the tops of trees on nuts. So, and there's a lot of nuts on good years to scan. So, Mel called them Tootsie Rolls. The egg masses, know someone else who's described them as, they look like train boxcars. And then stink bugs, got some adults, and then egg mass with some nymphs. And the box elder bug, this pest, we don't see it as often. It's not as widespread, but man, do they cause a lot of damage, especially on the smaller nut varieties like Aldrich and Butte. These ones, this pest can cause a lot of problems, especially if you're near a riparian area. So definitely be on the lookout for this one. As far as identification, it's also important to know what is not a pest. So while these two insects here are plant bugs, they are beneficials. So we got the rough stink bug and the assassin bug. The assassin bug, especially the nymph there in the bottom right-hand picture, looks a lot like a leaf-footed bug nymph. So, you want to really make sure you know what you're seeing in the field before you take that information to make treatment decisions. And this is another case of something that the symptoms that resemble plant bugs but are not. So you can see the bruising on the hull, what looks like corresponding puncture wounds on the inside of the shell. But when you pair it with other symptoms and some leaf analysis, this is actually severe bone deficiency that's causing not only the gumming of the kernel, but also really severe nut drop. And again, there it goes. And similar to this, we're seeing gummosis on the hulls. So could be thinking this could be plant bugs, but again, this is actually anthracnose infections causing the gummosis. And this one's a little different. You can see that's kind of an amber gumming, not so much clear, but it can be clear, especially if it's freshly starting to ooze out. So when it comes to monitoring, I thought I'd leave you guys some tips. I think Kent already covered some of these actually. The first one is know the field history. So this goes back to, visit the field regularly, take notes. If you have a block that had problems this year, there's a good chance it's had problems frequently in the past. And that could be because it's very near an overwintering site. So knowing what's around your field, are you by a riparian area? Are you near a residential area? These types of pests love to overwinter on structures or residential landscaping plants. And again, the riparian areas, those are the fields that I know when it comes to that season, when it gets to be April, I know I need to check certain blocks more diligently in order to get a jump on those pests as they start to arrive to the field. Look on the sunny sides of trees. So this is especially in the morning when you're out. The insects require, they don't generate their own heat, so they'll sun themselves out on the sunny exposed nuts. So as you're walking the field, if it's that time of year, really concentrate on the sunny sides. Also concentrate on edges. This is convenient, especially if you're me, and you're lazy. You don't want to walk too far. If you got a lot of ground to cover. And also UC research has shown that that the damage actually dissipates as you move into the orchard when it comes to the plant bug damage. So the edges is really where you want to focus your attention. And so like Kent said, I also like to carry a stick to knock branches because you can't, trying to scan every single nut on a tree is really time consuming, and you can scare up those adults at least and get them to fly off, and that can help to speed up, your monitoring. And use all your senses, put the smell up there. Obviously stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs both can put out like an alarm odor that's off-putting, and you can smell it. I'm not going to say I use that as my monitoring, but definitely the sound, their flight makes a very distinct sound. It's very different from the buzzing insects that you encounter, like honeybees. That's a very common sound in orchards. But there are a number of times where I've just inadvertently brushed past a branch, and I hear this it's kind of like a grasshopper, like a clicking sound as they fly away. And, if you spin around fast enough, sometimes you can catch them, either landing on the side or maybe just take a couple extra minutes to go investigate if that was actually a plant bug. And lastly, some varieties, like Mel talked about this, some varieties seem to be, I put preferred, but whether it's a preference or they're more susceptible, there are definitely some varieties that tend to be have more damage than others. And so again, this is our data from the last 3 years that shows the average plant bug damage, the top 5 varieties with the worst plant bug damage. And so I know it's hard to see the varieties, but there's 3, the Independence, Aldrich, and Butte are shown in the top 5 in all 3 of these varieties. And I'd say, yeah, that jives with what I see in the field. But again, this is an incomplete picture, because remember, this is at harvest time. This doesn't show you all the nuts and the varieties that were hit early in the season. So Monterey's on there in 22 at the bottom, the number 5 in 2022. But I've seen that variety get hammered and lose hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Like Mel said, it looks like they shook. That variety, they early in the season, the Monterey, I would put on that list. The nonpareil, if it's early enough and you got some leaf-footed bugs, they can get bad damage too. But definitely the Independence and the Aldrich and the Butte are ones that, all the plant bugs, whether it's a preference or whether it's just after the nonpareil have hardened off, those are the ones that haven't hardened off yet. They're maybe a little smaller. Those are the ones that we end up seeing a lot of damage on. So that can come into our management decisions as well. So you've done your monitoring, you've spent the time in the field, and maybe you found some plant bugs. Okay, now what, right? If you're thinking about spraying, you're probably going to reach for a pyrethroid. We've lost the Loras bands and organophosphates. So these are the most effective chemicals that are also the most economical to use against these pests, but they're also very broad spectrum. So now if you're using it, you're probably going to be thinking about, okay, what else am I going to have to add to the tank, like to prevent against spider mite flare-ups, stuff like that. So a quote unquote cheap pyrethroid spray now is becoming more expensive. You could look for something like Belay, which is said to be softer on beneficials, but I don't know, in our experience, it maybe doesn't have the same residual effect as the Asanas or bifentures, and we often have had to retreat fields after a Belay treatment, more often so than with the other products. So that's why it's important to know, how severe is this? Making those frequent regular checks. Is this a new thing? Have they been building for a while? Do we have to spray right now, or can we wait? If we're going already, okay, great, let's throw something in the tank. We can piggyback it with this treatment. But if we're not, can we wait a week or two? And one component of that could be, we've done that the last couple of years, is what time of year is it? So if it's before that shell hardening period, the nuts that get stung are not going to end up in your grade. So while, yeah, you're going to lose some nuts, if it's not that bad, maybe you can, stomach that a little bit, and we can delay until we know we're going to have to spray for navel orange worm or whatever it is, whatever's that treatment timing that's coming up. We can take our licks early in the season, let those nuts fall, knowing that they're not going to show up in the grade, save the cost of that treatment, especially when budgets are tight, and get them later. Varietal spray is another consideration, especially, we're seeing a lot of, at least I'm seeing a lot of plantings with nonpareil aldrich. And that's especially, I have one specifically, it's nonpareil aldrich, and it's a riparian area, and the aldrich always get hammered by box elder bugs. And box elder bug, by the time we get to, the end of April, and we're in May sometime, and, the nonpareil the shells are too big and too hard for the box elder bug to do any damage. So we've done varietal sprays on the aldrich only, and so you're only spraying half your acres. It's going to take half the time, half the material. So just to wrap it up, the future, plant bug pressure, potentially still increasing, and who knows, what's going to happen with the pyrethroids. The regulatory pressures, I don't know the future, but there is a potential, that we're going to be losing, those tools but the good news is, like Kent was just talking, we are getting hopefully soon going to get a new pheromone lure to not only make our lives easier in terms of monitoring, but I don't know if Kent wants to comment on this, but one of the articles I was reading was that this product might also have a potential for a track and kill program. So essentially putting out a set number of traps per acre as a treatment, essentially to attract and kill the insects instead of having to spray for them. So to wrap it up, if you leave here with anything, if you have problems, take the time to scout your fields. That's really what's gonna save you, on when it comes to plant bug. Regular checks are key. Take records, understand, where your problems are, because that's probably where they're going to be again next year. And then hopefully in the future, this new lure make our life easier, which is great, with the potential for losing, some tools out of our toolbox. I think that's it. Mike.
All right, thank you to our speakers. Are there any questions in the audience? And you can just, yeah.
Turn the lights on a little bit more. We have a general rule of thumb of whatever you get on the grade sheet, kind of just double that, because you lost that same percentage potentially in the field. It blew out at harvest. Do we have any kind of rule of thumb, or is this just so orchard specific, year specific, insect specific?
In my experience, that 2x rule applies. I do have a question though on plant bug, because you're not reducing the weight of the product very much. With navel orange worm, with other pests that are taking bites out of it and reducing the weight of that, or the specific gravity of that product, it's easy to say you're going to have stuff sucked out at the harvester. Also, you're going to have more than that sucked out during the aspiration and on the gravity deck at the huller sheller. Now, the hulling shelling industry is moving, it's changing, it's evolving, and we're seeing more and more shelling facilities with color sorters. And talking with the color sorter manufacturer, they're saying they can see in a lot of cases that brown spot. So you're going to be kicking those out as well. I'm going to stick with the 2x rule just as a general guideline.
Any other questions?
Yeah, do you think it'll be even higher if you add in the drop nets all before? Oh yeah, but here's the thing. That's orchard specific. The one example I had, that crop was devastated in April. It took off 80% of it, and the shot that Kent had, how do you factor that? So as I was listening to this, I was thinking of what one grower told me a few weeks ago. The best nutrient you can apply to orchard is the one that's found in the sole of your boot. You got to get out there and walk the fields and know what's going on, because it's going to vary from field to field.
Production you guys are working on, so the leaffooted bug, do you have an idea when it's going to be commercially available?
So the question was, the pheromone we're working on, will it be commercially available? So Jocelyn Miller has been a fantastic pheromone chemist to work with, and one of the reasons we did all those mealybug species together. Jocelyn, as any of the university folks, has the option to patent things, and he never has. So he basically identifies it, and then it's out there. So then it would be, and there's a number of industry folks here that work with the semiochemicals. It's up to them to pick it up after a certain point in time. We take it to a point where this is the pheromone component, this is how it's synthesized, this is the attraction we're getting, this is the correlation we're getting to damage, and then one of the industries will decide, is that valuable enough for us to pick up? Can we make it cheaply? They're much better at making pheromones than someone in the university, because they can gear up to a larger scale. I do wish we were capturing more. So clearly it's attractive. I do wish, though, we were getting counts of 20, 40, 50 per trap. And maybe that will happen when we switch to the yellow colored panel trap, something like that. But again, it's up to industry to decide that this is valuable for us, that we want to pick this up, and we want to try marketing something.
That's just for the leaffooted bug. You're not working on anything with the stink bug, the green stink bug.
There are, Lauren knows this better, there are a number of different stink bug pheromones, and there's a general stink bug lure that we did try. We tried the brown marmoset stink bug lure as well, but we've never gotten very great results, it seems like, First of all, sometimes we'll have 5 traps with 0 and 1 trap with 10 or 12. And you want to have consistency in an orchard to know that there's a consistent level of damage of insects around there. So I've not seen that work for me, and I'll punt the ball to you because you worked with this with BMSB.
Right, yeah. So for green stink bug, there isn't a really good pheromone lure that's been identified. There's typically a combination of lures you have to use, but like Kent said, it's not very good at showing what's representation in the field. But as far as a stink bug or a pheromone lure for the brown marmorated stink bug, there's a couple lures out there with Trace and Ag Bio who do a good job at capturing and giving a representation of stink bugs in the orchard. But you use those sticky panel traps for that identification. Is there any other questions? I have a question in general is so when people are thinking about this, are there multiple species they should be considering that are in the orchard at once, or is there only a single species that they should be looking for?
I'll start and pass this over. This was one of the questions I had with stink bug pheromones because you've got 5 different species now. So no one's going to have 5 different pheromone traps for 5 different stink bugs. I think what Mateo said was very valuable, that you get to know a certain field, a certain orchard, and some will have leaf-footed bug more consistently than others. Some will have green stink bug more consistently than others. Jalendra's got fields with BMSB fairly consistently, whereas I just don't see that as much in Fresno. So if you were to try to monitor with pheromones, you would probably use specific ones for that field that had a certain history of damage.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. As far as, I see leaf-footed bug in general, we don't, as a PCA, we don't really concern about going down to species level. But leaf-footed bug, I see kind of across the board everywhere. But the stink bugs, is really hit and miss, really specific to specific orchards or areas. And so yeah, I mean, as far as look out for leaf-footed bug everywhere. But, if you have a stink bug problem, it may or may not be just isolated to that specific area.
I want to ask a question.
Oh yeah, go for it.
The idea of look out for leaf-footed bug everywhere. Yeah, I'll agree with that. But do you see neighborhood influence as well? I've seen leaf-footed bug coming out of corn silage fields as the chopper's going through and going across the road and infesting orchards. And you think, okay, it's late in the season. I'm not worried about that. But then I hear growers telling me that they're mummy shaking trees and they're dropping stink bugs and plant bugs out of the trees during sanitation. So are these things now living in the orchards? Apparently so. And what are your neighboring crops? Like in that first instance that I had, alfalfa was next door. When you cut the alfalfa, that was the generation of the problem. Are other crops out there a consideration that you look at?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said, I mean, knowing the field history, knowing what's around you is definitely, gonna provide a lot of information. And so, it also depends on the time of year. Yeah, right now, you can go out into an orchard and potentially find both green stink bug and leaf-footed bug in the orchard right now. I know that research says that green stink bug will, can and does overwinter in the orchard. I don't feel like I see leaf-footed bugs overwintering in the orchard, but so I think if they're still in the orchard, they're probably feeding on. It probably has to do with your mummy load. If you're finding leaf-footed bugs, you probably have too many mummies, so which has other implications. So I would guess, and this is just totally a guess, I would say that they're probably transitioning out of the orchard and gonna eventually move to a different place to overwinter. But again, that's just a guess.
Yeah, just to add to that, we had a problem with table grape shipments this year. And the table grape where we had stink bugs in the clusters that were shipped overseas was near an alfalfa field. And I'm sure that's where they came from because we just typically don't get stink bugs feeding in grapes. And I only briefly mentioned that work we're doing with cover crops, trying to have a cover crop in the middle that was irrigated year-round. This is because we worked 25 years ago with cover crops in the middle that were watered by natural rainfall, fall, winter ground cover that would dry down in spring and summer. And what we found was that that housed overwintering stink bugs. And so when it dried down in the field, they would move up into the canopy, especially some of the small bugs as well. So not just what your orchard's nearby, but what you're planting in your orchard can impact the kinds of small and large bugs you've got.
This doesn't work in big blocks, but I know in small blocks, I'll start at the guy's house. If I see junipers, that's where I start. Yeah.
Okay, and I have one last question, and it's just kind of general. So, what are some potential long-term implications of reoccurring stink bug infestations? So, do you think that there'll be any effect on the almond tree's health or overall orchard productivity? Productivity to the orchards.
To me, it's all about yield and quality. So if you don't do something about it, can it get worse? I don't want to say that it's gotten worse in any individual orchard, but we know the trend of damage as a percentage of the total, as I've demonstrated, has grown. So it's not something you can ignore. You've got to take an intervention at some point.
Okay. Oh, one question.
Yeah, Mateo. Yeah, you were saying that the south side of the orchard probably be the, where the most sun is, probably would be a good place to do monitoring. That kind of simplifies monitoring quite a bit.
Yeah, it does.
So you can kind of monitor that area.
Mm-hmm.
And in covering the industry for decades, I've been in orchards where there was a tornadic type infestation flying in of leaf-footed bugs on the south side of the field.
Is this the south side of the orchard or the south side of the tree? The sunny side of the tree.
Well, it would be the south side of the orchard. I mean, if I was on the south side, and this kind of happened to come in, they could come on the east side, they would gravitate toward the south side, where the mark is, right?
Mhm.
It really simplifies the.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think along those lines, I think I do spend maybe too much time on the south sides of trees of orchards because they, especially early in the day. If I'm out, at 6 a.m., right after the sun's coming up, that's going to be the sunny side, and so that's where I'm going to spend my time looking for, in April if I'm looking for plant bugs. But again, if I know, so I think it comes down to the field. To the field specifics. If I know that field, the north side of the field is on a riparian area or up against a neighborhood where there are those overwintering hosts, I'm probably gonna if it's that time of year or I know that I need to be looking for plant bugs, I'll probably, based on that information, be checking the north side. But then still, as you're walking, if the north edge is shaded, then I'll be walking into the rows, looking at the what would be the east side of the tree on the sunny side. So I think it really comes down to that other information. If you can gather that other information to really help pinpoint where to look, that can help simplify things. But if without it, then you're kind of just having to look at all the edges.
Okay. All right. Thank you for everyone for attending, and thank you to our speakers. You did a great job, and I appreciated the shifting around and everything as well. So thanks.